The crash of a porcelain mug hitting the floor yanked me out of my thoughts. I stared at the broken pieces, scattered across the tiles, my breath caught in my chest. This was the third mug I'd broken this month. My hands, once steady and capable, now trembled for no good reason. I sighed, crouching down to clean the mess, the silence of the house pressing in on me like a heavy quilt. 2 years ago, this house was full of sound. Jonathan's quiet hums as he tinkered in the shed, the creak of his boots on the porch. Now it was just me, the garden, and endless evenings lost in books I couldn't concentrate on. That's when the knock came. Sharp. Unexpected. I froze, shards of porcelain still in my hand. Visitors were rare out here in rural Virginia, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, I stood, brushing my hands off on my jeans and heading to the door. When I opened it, I nearly stumbled back. Nick? There he was, my late husband's nephew, standing on the porch with an easy grin and a beat-up duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His dark hair was unruly, his eyes bright and curious like they always were, but he looked older than I remembered, broader, more grounded. "Hey, Aunt Ellen," he said, flashing that charming smile. "Thought I'd drop in. Surprise." "Surprise is right," I said, still trying to catch my breath. He stepped in without waiting for an invitation, dropping his bag by the stairs. "This place hasn't changed a bit. I could smell your hydrangeas from the driveway. Still taking care of the whole garden yourself." "Someone has to," I said, managing a smile as I closed the door behind him. Nick's energy filled the room, chasing away the quiet I'd grown used to. He flopped onto the couch, his long legs stretched out, as if he owned the place. "I needed a break," he said. "City life's too much sometimes. Thought the countryside might clear my head." "Nick," I said, folding my arms, "how long are you planning on staying?" He grinned. "A while." That evening, we sat on the porch, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the faint rumble of an approaching storm. I brought out iced tea, setting a glass in front of him. "Jonathan would have loved this," Nick said, staring out at the horizon. The quiet, the open air. I flinched at the mention of my husband's name, but Nick didn't seem to notice. He leaned back, his rocking chair creaking. "What do you even do out here all day?"
"Garden. Read.
"Fix things," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Fix things? Like what?" I shrugged. "Fences. Leaky faucets. Whatever needs fixing." Nick grinned, downing the rest of his tea. "You? Fixing fences? I've got to see this." The next morning, he got his wish. I was wrestling with a stubborn section of the old garden fence, my gloves caked with dirt, when Nick ambled out of the house. He looked at me, then at the fence, and shook his head. "You're going to hurt yourself doing that alone." "I've been managing just fine for years," I said. "Not anymore," he said, grabbing a pair of gloves. "Step aside." I watched, arms crossed, as he worked with an efficiency that reminded me of Jonathan. Only, unlike Jonathan, Nick wasn't silent. He cracked jokes, asked questions, and turned what should have been a chore into something almost enjoyable. "Why didn't Uncle Jonathan ever fix this?" he asked, tightening a nail. "He was always busy," I said. Nick glanced at me. "Too busy for you?" The question hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable. I didn't answer. Later that afternoon, rain clouds rolled in, and we retreated to the attic. Nick insisted on helping me sort through old boxes I'd been avoiding for years. "What's in here?" he asked, prying open a dusty trunk. "Memories," I said, my voice tight. He pulled out a stack of photos, flipping through them with a mix of curiosity and reverence. When he found one of me from my 20s, he paused. "Wow," he said softly. "You were beautiful." I laughed, brushing off the compliment. That was a long time ago. Nick's gaze lingered on the photo before meeting mine. "Doesn't matter." Something shifted in the room then, the kind of tension that settles in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I turned away, pretending to focus on another box, but the weight of his words followed me. That night, the storm hit hard. Thunder rattled the windows, and rain pounded against the roof. Nick went for a walk after dinner, leaving me alone with my thoughts. When he came back, soaked and windblown, he collapsed into the chair across from me. "You okay?" he asked, his green eyes sharp even in the dim light. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed me. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know," he said, leaning forward. "Whatever it is you're carrying." His words caught me off guard. No one had seen through me like that in years. For a moment, I couldn't speak. And just like that, Nick was inside my walls, and I wasn't sure how to shut him out. The storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy, damp with the aftermath of summer rain. Nick and I had decided to tackle the attic, mostly because he'd been relentless about giving me grief for avoiding it. "What's up there, anyway?" he'd teased earlier, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Skeletons? A treasure map? Dust and regret," I'd muttered, but even I couldn't avoid the clutter forever. The attic was a sweltering oven, even with the small window cracked open. Sunlight poured in, catching the dust motes that swirled around us as we sorted through boxes. Nick had his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing tanned forearms that worked efficiently through piles of clutter. "Did Uncle Jonathan ever come up here?" he asked, handing me an old lamp that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. "Not much," I said, brushing a cobweb off my sleeve. This was always my domain. He didn't have the patience for sorting through memories. Nick gave me a knowing look, but didn't press. That was the thing about him. He had this uncanny ability to push just far enough without crossing a line. We worked in companionable silence for a while, until Nick stumbled upon an old wooden trunk. "This looks promising," he said, prying it open with a grin. Inside were stacks of photographs, yellowed with age. I froze when I saw them, the familiar faces staring back at me from decades ago. "Wow," Nick said, pulling out a photo and holding it up to the light. "Is this you?" I leaned over, my heart tightening. It was a picture of me in my early 20s, sitting on a beach with my hair windblown and my smile carefree. Jonathan must have taken it. He always had a knack for catching moments like that, back when we were still us. "It's just an old photo," I said, reaching for the box to distract myself. But Nick didn't let it go. He studied the picture, his expression unreadable. "You are beautiful," he said softly, the words lingering in the air between us. I let out a nervous laugh, brushing it off. That was a lifetime ago. He set the photo down carefully, his green eyes meeting mine. "Doesn't mean it's not true." Something shifted then. The attic, once filled with the chatter of sorting through junk, grew quiet. The air felt thicker, as if the room itself had paused to listen. I turned away, focusing on the next box, but I could feel Nick's gaze on me, steady and unwavering. "Why don't you talk about him more?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated, my fingers brushing against an old quilt as I tried to find the words. "What's there to say?" Jonathan was steady, reliable, but not much for conversation. Nick tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "You make it sound like he was more of a roommate than a husband." I winced at the truth of it.
He wasn't a bad man, Nick.
He just kept his distance, even when he was here. Nick leaned against a stack of boxes, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "And you're okay with that? With how it all turned out?" The question hit me like a slap, not because it was rude, but because it was fair. I didn't have an answer, so I busied myself with the quilt, pretending to inspect it. We went back to sorting, but the easy rhythm of before was gone. Every glance, every accidental brush of his hand as we passed boxes, felt charged. Then it happened. Nick found another photo, this one of Jonathan and me on our wedding day. My dress was simple, my smile wide, and Jonathan's arm was around my shoulders in a gesture that looked more like obligation than affection. Nick studied it for a long time, longer than necessary. His jaw tightened, and his fingers brushed over the edges of the picture like he was afraid it might crumble. "Was he ever happy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of his question settled over me, pressing against my chest. I didn't know what he wanted me to say, what answer he expected. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. "Sometimes I'm not sure I was either." Nick's gaze lifted from the photo, locking onto mine. The attic seemed to shrink, the space between us humming with an unspoken tension. "You deserve to be," he said, his voice steady and low. The air felt electric, the moment stretched taut. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the spell, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a widow, not as someone's aunt, but as a woman. It terrified me. "Let's take a break," I said abruptly, standing so fast I nearly tripped over a box. Nick hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, sure." As we climbed down the attic ladder, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, and I didn't know if I was ready to face what it meant. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, catching the steam rising from my coffee mug. I stared out at the garden, at the half-finished fence and the overgrown flower beds. The to-do list in my head felt endless, but all I could think about was the way Nick had looked at that photograph. I shook off the thought, brushing it aside like a stray cobweb. It was nothing. It had to be. Nick wandered in, barefoot, his hair still mussed from sleep. "Morning," he said, his voice gravelly. He poured himself a mug of coffee, moving with an ease that made him look like he belonged here. "Morning," I replied. I hesitated, the words already forming before I could stop them. "I was thinking about tackling the garden today. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're up for it." He grinned, leaning against the counter. "Are you asking for help, Aunt Ellen? Because I thought you were the I've got it handled type." I rolled my eyes. "Just say yes, Nick." 20 minutes later, we were outside, boots sinking into the damp soil as we worked side by side. Nick grabbed the shovel, digging up weeds with an enthusiasm that made me laugh. "You're enjoying this too much," I said, kneeling to pull out stubborn roots by hand. "It's therapeutic," he said, tossing a clump of weeds into the wheelbarrow. "You don't get this kind of peace in the city. Just noise and deadlines." "You always seem to thrive on that," I said. "The fast pace, the excitement." He paused, leaning on the shovel, his expression suddenly distant.
"Yeah.
Maybe I used to." The weight in his voice caught me off guard. I straightened, brushing dirt from my gloves. "What changed?" He shrugged, looking out at the rows of flowers swaying in the breeze. "I don't know. At some point it all started to feel hollow. Like I was chasing something I couldn't even name." The raw honesty in his words left me momentarily speechless. Nick had always seemed so confident, so sure of himself. Seeing this vulnerability made him feel different. "You think you'll find it here?" I asked softly, gesturing to the sprawling countryside. He glanced at me, his green eyes serious. "I don't know. Do you think I will?" The question hung between us, heavy and charged. For a moment, I couldn't look at him. Instead, I focused on the garden, on the dirt under my nails and the sweat trickling down my temple. "I think clarity doesn't come from where you are," I said finally. "It comes from letting yourself feel whatever it is you're avoiding." Nick's gaze lingered on me, and I felt it like a weight, like he was trying to pull the truth out of me without saying a word. "You're probably right," he said after a long pause, his voice quieter now. We worked in silence for a while after that, the air between us thick with something unspoken. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, we stopped for a break, sitting on the edge of the fence we'd been mending. Nick handed me a bottle of water, and I took a long sip, grateful for the coolness against my throat. "You never told me why you stayed here," he said suddenly. I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "After Uncle Jonathan passed," he said, his tone gentle but probing. "You could have sold the place. Started fresh somewhere else. But you stayed." I shrugged, trying to sound casual. It's home. Nick tilted his head, studying me like he was trying to see past the words. Is it? Or is it just safe? The question hit me like a stone, sinking deep into a part of me I didn't want to face. Why are you asking? I said, deflecting. Because, he said, leaning back on his hands, I came here looking for clarity. And now I'm wondering if I'll leave just as lost as I came. His words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him he'd find his way, but I wasn't sure I believed it myself. What are you looking for, Nick? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me, his gaze steady and unflinching. I don't know. Maybe that's the problem. But being here, it feels like I'm starting to figure it out. The vulnerability in his voice, the way he looked at me like I might hold the answers he was searching for, made something inside me shift. And that terrified me. I think we should call it a day, I said abruptly, standing and brushing the dirt off my jeans. Nick hesitated, then nodded.
Yeah.
Sure. As we headed back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lines between us were starting to blur. And I wasn't sure what scared me more, the fact that it was happening or the fact that I didn't want it to stop. Dinner was quiet, at least at first. The sound of forks scraping against plates filled the air, the silence occasionally broken by the faint hum of crickets outside the open window. I'd made roasted chicken and a salad with fresh tomatoes from the garden, simple, comforting, like most of my meals these days. Nick sat across from me, chewing thoughtfully, his gaze flickering to the shelf where Jonathan's old photo albums were stacked. I noticed but said nothing, letting him take his time. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair, his plate clean, and gestured toward the albums. Can I? He asked, his voice casual, but his eyes curious. Of course, I said, swallowing a lump in my throat. He grabbed the nearest album, a thick, leather-bound one with edges frayed from years of handling. As he flipped through the pages, the sound of rustling paper seemed louder than it should have. These must go back decades, he said, pausing on a photo of Jonathan and me standing on the front porch, arms slung around each other. I looked so young, so full of energy, my hair wild in the breeze. Jonathan looked as he always did, reserved, his smile polite but distant. Nick tilted the album toward me. You look happy here. Were you? The question stopped me mid-sip of my wine. I set the glass down slowly, the stem slipping slightly in my damp palm. I was, I said after a moment. In my own way. In your own way, he repeated, his tone laced with curiosity. What does that mean? I sighed, leaning back in my chair. Jonathan was a good man.
Steady.
Reliable. But he wasn't present, not in the way that matters. Our relationship was more about routines and roles than connection. Nick frowned, turning the page to another photo, one of Jonathan standing alone, his hands in his pockets, staring off into the distance. Sounds lonely, he said, echoing the same word he'd used before. It was, I admitted, surprised at how easily the words came out. But I told myself it was enough. I thought, maybe that's all marriage is, being there, even if you're not really seen. Nick didn't say anything at first. He just studied the photo, his fingers brushing lightly over the edges as if he could feel the weight of the moment it captured. Do you think it's too late? He asked finally, his voice quieter now. Too late for what? For you, he said, his green eyes lifting to meet mine. To start over. To find something more. The question hit me like a jolt, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at him, the lines between us blurring in a way I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Nick, I started, my voice trembling. What are you really asking me? His gaze didn't waver. I don't know, he said, but the way he looked at me told me otherwise. The air in the room felt charged, the kind of tension that prickles your skin and makes it impossible to look away. I felt something shift inside me, a realization I wasn't ready to face. Nick wasn't just Jonathan's nephew anymore. He was something else, someone who saw me in a way I hadn't been seen in years. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I think I need some air," I said, grabbing my glass of wine and heading for the porch without waiting for a response. Outside, the evening was cool, the stars scattered across the sky like spilled glitter. I gripped the glass tightly, my thoughts racing. What was I doing? What was he doing? A few minutes later, I heard the creak of the screen door behind me. Nick stepped out, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He didn't say anything, just stood next to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said finally, his voice soft. "You didn't," I said quickly, though my voice betrayed me. We stood there in silence, the night wrapping around us like a heavy blanket. I could feel his gaze on me, and it took everything in me not to turn and meet it. "I just think you deserve more," he said quietly. "You deserve to be seen." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Instead, I took another sip of wine, the liquid burning as it slid down my throat. "I should head to bed," I said abruptly, setting the glass down on the railing. Nick didn't move, his gaze steady. "Good night, Ellen," he said, his voice low and full of something I couldn't name. I nodded, turning quickly and heading inside, my heart pounding in my chest. As I climbed the stairs, I realized that the lines I'd been so careful to keep in place were slipping, and I didn't know how to stop it. The storm came suddenly, as summer storms often do. One moment, the air was heavy and still, and the next, the wind was whipping through the trees, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the roof with relentless force. I was in the living room, staring out at the chaos beyond the glass, when Nick walked in, his hair damp from stepping outside to grab the last of the tools we'd left on the porch. "Looks like we're not going anywhere," he said, shaking off droplets and grinning like a kid. "No kidding," I muttered, my arms crossed. The storm made the house feel smaller, closer somehow. I could feel the electricity in the air, but it wasn't just from the weather. Nick glanced around, his eyes landing on the stack of books I'd been meaning to organize for months. "Guess we've got time to tackle that, huh?" I hesitated, then nodded.
Sure.
"Why not?" We worked side by side, pulling dusty novels and photo albums from the shelves, sorting them into piles. The storm raged outside, the flicker of lightning casting sharp shadows across the room. At one point, I reached for a heavy book just as Nick did. Our hands brushed, just a fleeting moment, barely more than a touch, but it sent a jolt through me like I'd grabbed a live wire. I froze, my fingers still on the book, my breath caught in my chest. Nick didn't pull away. Instead, his hand stayed there, warm and steady, his green eyes meeting mine. "Ellen," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. I couldn't speak. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his tone filled with an earnestness that made my chest tighten. "Whatever you're carrying, you're not alone." He reached out, his fingers gently wrapping around mine. The gesture was so simple, so small, but it felt monumental, like crossing an invisible line I hadn't even realized was there. "Nick," I started, my voice trembling. "What are you?" "I don't know," he interrupted, his voice raw and honest. I can't watch you keep everything locked inside. It's not fair to you." The words hit me like a wave, crashing over everything I'd been trying so hard to hold back. For years, I'd carried my grief, my loneliness, and my sense of duty like a weight strapped to my shoulders. And here was Nick, offering to share it, to lighten the load in a way I hadn't let anyone do since Jonathan's death. His hand tightened around mine, and before I could think better of it, I squeezed back. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence, made something inside me crack wide open. I looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected, vulnerability, longing, and something deeper I didn't dare name. This isn't right, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Maybe not, Nick admitted, his voice low, but it feels honest. The room felt smaller, the storm outside muffled by the weight of what was happening between us. My mind was racing, a cacophony of guilt and desire and confusion, but my body refused to move. Before I could stop myself, I reached up, brushing a stray lock of damp hair from his forehead. The gesture was instinctive, maternal even, but the way his eyes searched mine turned it into something else entirely. "Ellen," he said again, his voice a whisper. I didn't know what I was going to say, if I was going to say anything at all, but the moment was broken by a sharp crack of thunder that made us both jump. The sound jolted me back to reality, and I pulled my hand away, stepping back as if the space between us could somehow erase what had just happened. "We should keep sorting," I said, my voice shaky. Nick hesitated, his expression unreadable, but then he nodded.
Yeah.
Sure. We worked in silence after that, the storm outside echoing the turmoil inside me. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, I couldn't shake the feeling of his hand on mine, or the way his words lingered like a whisper in the back of my mind. "You're not alone." For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. And that terrified me more than anything. The leaves crunched underfoot, a symphony of golds, oranges, and reds scattered across the forest floor. Autumn had arrived in full force, wrapping the woods in a brisk chill and the smell of damp earth. I tugged my jacket tighter around me, but even the cold couldn't calm the unease bubbling beneath my skin. Nick walked a few steps ahead, hands in his pockets, his frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the fiery backdrop of trees. He'd insisted on the walk, saying we needed to get out of the house, to clear the air. But now, with every step, I felt the tension between us growing heavier. "How far do these trails go?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder with a small smile. "They loop around eventually," I said, keeping my tone light. "This used to be Jonathan's favorite spot. He said the trees reminded him of where he grew up." Nick nodded, but his smile faltered at the mention of Jonathan. He stopped, crouching to pick up a leaf, studying its veins like it held the answers to unspoken questions. "You okay?" I asked, my voice softer now. He stood, brushing his hands on his jeans. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone cautious, as if he was testing the weight of his words before letting them out. "About us." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "What about us?" Nick sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know where this is going," he admitted. "I don't even know if it should go anywhere. But I know one thing. I don't want to keep walking this path alone. Not anymore." The forest seemed to hold its breath, the distant rustle of leaves the only sound. I stared at him, the honesty in his voice cutting through the confusion that had clouded my mind for weeks. "Nick, whatever this is, it's complicated," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You're Jonathan's nephew."
"You're
Ellen," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're not just someone's widow, or someone's aunt, or someone's anything. You're you." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "And you're Jonathan's family. It's not right." "Maybe not," he said, stepping closer. His green eyes locked onto mine, steady and unflinching. "But it feels real, doesn't it?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because he was right. The wind picked up, scattering leaves around us, and I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could shield myself from the truth. Nick stayed silent, waiting, his presence warm and steady even as the cold bit at my cheeks. "What do you want me to say, Nick?" I asked finally, my voice breaking. "That I feel it too? That I don't know how to stop? Because I don't. But that doesn't mean it's okay." "It doesn't have to be okay," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "It just has to be honest." I turned to him, my chest tight with the weight of everything unspoken between us. This isn't just about me, I said. If we go down this road, it's going to change everything. For you. For me. For both of us. Are you ready for that? Nick stepped closer, his hand brushing mine. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a spark through me all the same. I don't know where this leads, he said. But I know I want to figure it out. With you. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into something vast and terrifying and irresistible. I'm scared, Nick, I whispered, the tears threatening to spill. So am I, he said, his voice barely audible. But maybe that's okay. I closed my eyes, the wind tugging at my hair, the smell of autumn thick in the air. Every instinct in me screamed to pull away, to walk back to the safety of what I knew. But my heart, traitorous as it was, wanted something else. When I opened my eyes, Nick was watching me, his expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. And in that moment, I realized that whatever choice I made, there was no going back. I need time, I said finally, my voice trembling. I need to think. Nick nodded, his hand falling away from mine. Take all the time you need, he said, his tone gentle. But there was something in his eyes, something that said he wasn't going to let this go. As we walked back to the house, the silence between us wasn't cold or distant. It was something else entirely. Something alive, like the forest around us. And I knew, deep down, that no matter what choice I made, my life would never be the same. The sun hung low in the sky, spilling streaks of orange and pink across the horizon. It was one of those sunsets that felt too beautiful to be real, the kind you'd see in a postcard but never expect to experience firsthand. I stood in the doorway of the house, watching Nick as he pulled a blanket around his shoulders on the porch. He looked peaceful, but I knew better. The tension between us had been building for weeks, and it wasn't going to disappear on its own. I stepped outside, the wooden boards creaking under my feet. Nick turned, his green eyes catching the last light of the day. He smiled, but it was a tentative thing, like he wasn't sure where this was going either. Mind if I join you? I asked, my voice soft. Always, he said, shifting to make room on the bench. I sat down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. He held out a corner of the blanket, and after a moment's hesitation, I let him drape it over my shoulders. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, where words would have only gotten in the way. I've been thinking, I said finally, staring out at the horizon. Nick chuckled softly. That sounds dangerous. I nudged him with my elbow, but my lips twitched into a smile despite myself. I'm serious, Nick. So am I, he said, his tone growing softer. I've been thinking too. The weight of what we weren't saying hung between us, pressing against my chest. I took a deep breath, my fingers gripping the edge of the blanket like it was an anchor. Whatever this is between us, it scares me, I admitted. It feels like stepping into something I can't control. Nick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Do you think I'm not scared too? I don't know what this is either, Ellen. I just know I can't pretend it's not there. His words were raw, honest, and they broke something loose inside me. For weeks, I'd been holding on to the fear, the guilt, the voices in my head telling me that this was wrong, that it couldn't work, that I was being foolish. But sitting there with Nick, under the fading light of the day, I realized that life was messy. It was complicated and terrifying and unpredictable. And maybe that was okay. I don't have the answers, I said, my voice trembling. I don't even know where to start. But I know I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of living in the past. Nick turned to me, his gaze steady. So, what are you saying? I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. But then I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw not just the man he was, but the possibility of what we could be. I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop overthinking everything, I said. Maybe it's time to take a chance. His expression softened, a mix of relief and something deeper. You mean that? I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. I don't know where this will lead, Nick, but I think I want to find out. The smile that broke across his face was like sunlight after a storm, bright, warm, and full of hope. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. We sat there in silence, watching the sun dip below the hills, the sky turning from fiery orange to a deep, velvety purple. The cool evening air wrapped around us, but under the blanket, his presence was enough to keep me warm. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever: peace. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be questions, doubts, and moments when I'd wonder if I'd made the right choice. But as I sat there with Nick, his hand steady in mine, I realized that life didn't come with guarantees or perfect resolutions. Sometimes it just gave you a chance to start again. And sometimes that was enough. As the first stars began to appear in the night sky, I leaned my head against Nick's shoulder, letting the weight of the moment settle around us. Tomorrow, I said quietly, a small smile playing on my lips, we'll figure out the rest. Tomorrow, he agreed, his voice low but steady. And in that moment, with the world wrapped in twilight and the future uncertain, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way forward. Together.